Welcome back, everyone, to the last session of today's EU Non-proliferation and Disarmament Next Generation workshop. And for those of you who are joining us only now, welcome. Unfortunately, I have a little bit of sad news. Kanica Rakhra, the chair that we envisioned and invited for this session, who was also one of the selected speakers from last year's workshop, and since then a kind aficionado of our events, unfortunately had to leave us earlier than expected due to unexpected circumstances. And this is a true pity because I personally know that how much she was invested in getting in touch with the speakers and making sure that this session would have been a success. So, but she was very efficient, so she forwarded me her remarks, and instead of rambling about the necessity of tackling the challenges, the regional challenges in non-proliferation, I'm just going to read her remarks so that you can have a very smooth session. So, welcome again to the last panel of the workshop on regional threats to non-proliferation and arms control. Many of the panelists in the previous session spoke about arms control treaties, their future in these uncertainties in certain times, the growing use of artificial intelligence and cyber, and the fight against proliferation. This panel promises to end the workshop with some very interesting perspectives ranging from the Middle East to Southeast Asia and Latin America. Before I introduce our first panelist, I would like to share a few concepts about the evolving regional threats. When we try to understand arms control, the primary region that comes to mind is the transatlantic. And while the transatlantic still remains important, and we hope that arms control does return to the region, the Trans-Pacific has gradually become a challenge for states engaging in arms control. So when it comes to arms control, one can experience a shift in regional threats. But when we try to understand non-proliferation, we are reminded of the non-proliferation long network that spanned across regions and continents, from Europe and the Middle East to Southeast Asia, to South Asia and Northeast Asia. The need for strengthening export controls and tracking dual-use items was a direct result of the loopholes in the international non-proliferation network. The international community is working towards strengthening its checks and balances and to ensure that proliferation does not become a threat to the world. These processes are continuous and need constant evolution, but what is certain is that they have not been and quite likely will not be region-specific. That said, the panelists today would be giving region-specific analysis, will be giving specific region analysis of some of the problems related to arms control and non-proliferation. The presenters' bio have been circulated, but I would just like to introduce the speakers briefly before I hand over the floor to each one of them. Our first panelist is Dr. Hanna Notte. Hanna is a senior non-recent scholar with the James Martin Center for Non-Proliferation Studies and has previously worked in informal and Track 2 diplomacy on Middle East issues. Her work in Track 2 and at CNS is a continuum of the research that she completed as part of her PhD at Oxford University. She will be sharing her perspectives on the role of the United States of America and the Russian Federation in the Middle East, primarily looking at the Syrian case study at the JCPOA. Our second panelist is Alain Ponce Blancas, a research and communication officer at OPANAL, Mexico. He has a dual degree in WMD Non-proliferation, Nuclear Policy and Global Security from the Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey and the Moscow State Institute of International Relations, and has worked for the Mexican Foreign Ministry at the Directorate General for the United Nations from 2007 to 2016. His presentation would focus on the problematic P5 declarations in the context of the Treaty of Tlatelolco, and the provisions within the treaty that are affected by these declarations. Arguing in favor of the proposal of OPANAL to engage the P5, he will share the benefits of the proposal and its impact not only for Latin America, for the Latin American nuclear weapons free zone, but for other regions as well. The third panelist for the session is Phonenipha Mathouchanh. I really hope I got your name right. If I didn't, I apologize for that. A former Laos diplomat, Phonenipha has served in the disarmament division of her ministry and was also advisor at the permanent mission of Laos to the United Nations in New York. A 2013 UN Disarmament Fellow, Phonenipha is currently an independent consultant working on disarmament and non-proliferation. She will be giving a Southeast Asian or ASEAN perspective on establishing and maintaining a state system of accounting for and control, SSAC, of nuclear material. She will be sharing her argument that for many states in the region, establishing both an authority and an SSAC system comes with a series of challenges. Exploring the different challenges in her presentation and based on her personal experience, Phonenipha would share some recommendations for states to facilitate the fulfillment of their safeguards obligation in light of the comprehensive safeguards agreements, therefore better contributing to the nuclear non-proliferation regime in Asia. Our final speaker, and also the youngest budding scholar of the panel, is Nour. Nour is currently working with the IAEA and is on her way to enter the International Security Master's Program at the American University of Beirut. Congratulations. She will be discussing the prospects of a nuclear model in the Middle East for Iran and Saudi Arabia, inspired by the Nuclear Brazilian Argentine Agency for Accounting and Control, ABACC. While the situation in Latin America and the Middle East does not draw instant comparisons, she will explore what such an agreement might look like and how it could be reached. Without further ado, Hanna, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Federica. Can you hear me fine? Great.
Yes, we can.
Thank you for the kind introduction and for the invitation. I'm very happy to speak on this final panel today, which, as you said, is dedicated to regional threats to non-proliferation. And I want to focus my remarks on US-Russian arms control cooperation in the Middle East in particular. Now, we have arguably seen an absence of such cooperation more recently, most notably in the US and Russia's divergent approaches to the JCPOA, but also their frictions within the OPCW on Syria's disarmament-related obligations. But of course, also on the broader Middle East WMD free zone issue, with the US remaining absent from the first conference on the zone that was convened under UN General Assembly auspices last November. What I want to do is suggest 3 lessons that we can draw from past American-Russian cooperation on the Syrian and Iranian dossiers, and then conclude by suggesting some avenues for confidence building or cooperation under the incoming Biden administration. So I'll start with the first lesson, which to my mind is that in pursuing non-proliferation cooperation in the Middle East, the US and Russia need a willingness to compromise on carrots and sticks vis-a-vis Middle Eastern actors. Let's look at Syria first. Syria, as we know, acceded to the Chemical Weapons Convention, the CWC, in 2013. And at that time, you clearly saw that the US and Russia were able to compromise on elements of engagement and pressure vis-a-vis Syria when they were working out the details of the disarmament process. Those details were reflected in what was called a hybrid framework. You had an OPCW Executive Council decision and a UN Security Council resolution 2118 at the time. So on the one hand, things like a very tight disarmament schedule or Chapter 7 language in the Security Council resolution, those were critical elements of pressure vis-a-vis Syria. That was important for the United States. Russia, on the other hand, emphasized Syria's sovereign engagement in disarmament at the time. That was reflected in things like the status of mission agreement that was negotiated with the Syrian authorities at the time. The crucial point to make here is that the US and Russia managed to find compromises on all those issues. If we turn to Iran's nuclear program, the US and Russia equally managed to strike that balance between pressure and engagement, or sticks and carrots, for years. For instance, in the lead up to Resolution 1929 in 2010, that's a period I've researched extensively in my PhD dissertation, when what you saw is the Obama administration pursuing a so-called dual track approach vis-a-vis the Iranians, which initially emphasized engagement over pressure, especially with Moscow. And that was reflected, for instance, in the Tehran research reactor proposal at the time, in which the US wanted to make Russia a lead actor. And since Moscow perceived that element of engagement vis-a-vis the Iranians to be sincere, I think once Moscow grew more frustrated with Iranian intransigence in the face of such engagement, it also became more willing over time to pursue a political path with Washington, of which sanctions would be a part. Now, more recently, of course, this delicate balancing act between carrots and sticks was lost with the Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign vis-a-vis Iran. Let's turn to the second lesson. I think legal agreements reached by the United States and Russia, which underpin their non-proliferation efforts in the Middle East, are only as robust as the political interests that sustain them. That's something we've clearly seen recently. Again, on Syria, I've mentioned you had a hybrid legal framework in 2013 that was crucial to make this disarmament process work. But once allegations of chemical weapons use in Syria resumed from 2014, we have seen continuous contestation over the legality of the OPCW's pursuit of attribution and accountability that has played out over various mechanisms, including the so-called JIM, the Joint Investigative Mechanism, or more recently with the IIT, the Investigation and Identification Team's efforts, where Russia basically says these mechanisms violate the Chemical Weapons Convention. There's even legal contestation now as to how the OPCW should handle Syria's initial declarations to the CWC, where basically the US and Russia, and it's not just the US and Russia, but also allied states, offer different readings of the treaty. The US and others view Syria as being non-compliant with the treaty, given a failure to provide complete and accurate declarations to date, whereas Russia and others argue that compliance is inherently a process and changes and additions to initial declarations are routine practice. On Iran, we have seen similar legal contestation playing out over the summer. The Trump administration's contention that it remained a legal party to Resolution 2231 and could therefore force a unilateral snapback of sanctions against Iran, that's something that was considered untenable by Russia and other members of the Council. Now, my bottom line here is that as and when you see this joint American-Russian interest in non-proliferation take a back seat vis-a-vis other interests they're pursuing in the region, the underlying agreements are quickly overtaken by politics and legal terms become contested. Turning to my third lesson, I think it is crucial for the US and Russia to insulate their non-proliferation cooperation in the Middle East from their broader divergences in the region and indeed from frictions in their bilateral relationship. If you look at the Syrian disarmament operation in 2013-2014, it is actually really interesting what the two sides were able to do, considering that you had the onset of the Ukraine crisis essentially hitting right in the middle of that effort. I mean, it was a complex effort that was conducted on the ground by an OPCW UN joint mission, unprecedented. But at the time, I guess there was a short-lived interest convergence between the US and Russia. And to US officials, I mean, let's not forget the American government had an issue with Syria, with the Syrian government at the time. But to US officials, pursuing the narrow interest of chemical disarmament was the right thing, even if it had to accept a role for the Syrian government in the process. And then that whole operation was consciously insulated by both sides from these broader frictions. And I guess something similar can be said for negotiations leading up to the JCPOA. I think today's such insulation of cooperation has become close to impossible. The Syrian chemical weapons issue has become so polarized within the OPCW and the UN Security Council. Now, the Skripal and Navalny cases have further compounded that friction. It is hard to see how the sides can return to even technical cooperation until there's a broader improvement in the relationship. Nonetheless, I want to end on a constructive note and suggest two ideas for confidence building now that we are past the US elections. One idea is of a slightly more technical nature. The other one is a bit broader. On the more technical side, Syria, we actually have the Conference of States Parties to the CWC coming up next week, actually, in The Hague. And I think the issue of Syria's non-engagement on its CW declarations could well come to a head. So just for quick context, the OPCW Executive Council passed a decision on July 9th, reacting to the first report of the IIT, the Investigation and Identification Team in April, adopted a decision in July saying that Syria has 90 days to declare now the totality of its CW program. And now that deadline has passed and Syria has not responded to the request. So the issue could well come to a head next week in The Hague. And states parties could take procedural measures against Syria under Article 12 of the treaty, for instance, suspending Syria's voting rights. Now, what could be done to prevent this from blowing up? Russia has shown in the past that it can elicit cooperation by the Syrian government, whether on CW issues or more broadly on the conflict. So could Moscow impress upon Damascus the importance of taking this issue more seriously? There is another mechanism which is called the DAT, the Declaration Assessment Team. It's an older mechanism to engage on Syria's initial declarations under the treaty. And it was actually established in accord with the Syrian government. So could Moscow get Damascus to engage on that more seriously? There have been 23 rounds of consultations between the Syrian government and the DAT. So things are sort of ongoing, but the outstanding issues are not being resolved. So more has to happen here. And that could be an important gesture by Russia to maintain a modicum of goodwill within the OPCW. I doubt that more will be possible in the current climate. I will say, though, that I do believe that Russia associates a past legacy of successful international cooperation with the OPCW, which it does value and which it will want to continue to shape from within. And actually, Russia's permanent representative to the UN, he gave a lengthy interview on the OPCW last week, quite interesting, in which he again attacked the OPCW's technical secretariat, but he also said, and I quote him, "We are not saying that the OPCW itself is unnecessary or unimportant. It remains an essential tool for preventing the production and use of chemical weapons." So there is an interest here to maintain some cooperation. On some broader confidence building regarding Iran, of course, what we will likely see now under a Biden presidency is some form of return to the JCPOA. Now, everyone is waiting and debating to see what form that will take. There's been a whole flurry of suggestions by think tanks, Track 2 efforts, former Obama administration officials on how that re-entry could look like. People have talked about a more for more approach or a freeze for freeze approach. I don't want to lay out the various scenarios here, but rather point to something else. Now, part of why the JCPOA was always criticized from within the region from the beginning was a perception by Israel and other Arab states that the agreement did not positively change other Iranian policies in the region, most notably Iran's pursuit of a so-called offensive defense strategy through proxies in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. And from what I understand, there is now a broad realization in Washington that this time there's a need to accompany any nuclear diplomacy with a parallel conversation on these other regional issues, questions about regional security. The question is really how you do that, what's the timing, what's the sequencing, what's the relationship between these approaches. Now, to bring this back to the US and Russia, I think if you pursue such an effort, you could bring the two sides back into a conversation on regional security and arms control as well. Russia, interestingly, has repeatedly shown an interest in discussing regional security in the Middle East and even Iran's role within that, though as a matter of principle, Moscow has always argued that this is separate from the nuclear file. But in October last month, when Russia had the presidency of the UN Security Council, they actually convened a debate on Gulf security measures and their Gulf security concept. And I also feel that Moscow possibly felt slightly sidelined by the Trump administration's diplomacy towards normalization, the so-called Abraham Accords between Gulf states and Israel, and it wants to be back in the conversation. So does China. So if there's some room here for a return to the JCPOA plus an attempt for a more multilateral process that also addresses regional security, which would include Russia in the conversation, maybe that could even have a positive spillover effect onto other arms control files in the Middle East, including maybe even the WMD free zone effort, though here much will also depend on the future trajectory of American foreign policy vis-a-vis Israel and other things that are very much up in the air as we speak. I'll end here and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hanna, for this extremely informative presentation, for sharing lessons learned, and also some provisions of what the new Biden administration might look like in terms of cooperation on these files. I guess we will just wait and see. We will just have to wait and see what happens, particularly next week, as you were saying. With this in mind, I will give the floor to Alain now.
Thank you, Federica. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Perfect. So thank you for your kind introduction. It is truly an honor to participate today at this panel on regional threats to non-proliferation and arms control. So I would like to thank the organizers for this opportunity and just to share some thoughts on the way how to strengthen the norm established by the nuclear weapon-free zones. My presentation, as you already mentioned, will be focused on the nuclear weapon-free zone in Latin America and the Caribbean, originated by the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons in Latin America and the Caribbean, best known as the Treaty of Tlatelolco. So I particularly touch upon the issue of the additional protocols to the treaty, to which the 5 nuclear weapon states are parties to, and the declarations made by the time they sign or ratify these protocols that are in fact reservations. So I will now share my screen with to present some slides. So here we are. So to that end, I will first present an overview, a brief overview of the main provisions and obligations contained in the Treaty of Tlatelolco. Secondly, I will refer to the zone of application, which is right in the middle of the issue of the additional protocol and interpretative declarations. Third, I will briefly explain the difference between Additional Protocol 1 and Additional Protocol 2, as well as those provisions that are problematic to the states parties. And finally, I will present and briefly explain a potential solution to this issue, which is in fact not new, but has been largely overlooked by the nuclear weapon states, with reservations to these protocols, alongside with some arguments in favor of this initiative of adjustment, as well as some conclusions. So to commence with, well, you are pretty aware of the inception and the origins of the Treaty of Tlatelolco. and basically the event that triggered the creation, which was the missile crisis, the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. And ever since the inception of the treaty, this innovative approach of the nuclear weapon-free zones has been one of the most successful stories in nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation diplomacy. And it also has served to of inspiration and model to some other regions in the world. So the Treaty of Tlatelolco was open for signature on 14 February 1967, and it entered into force in 1969. As I mentioned, it established the first nuclear weapon-free zone in a densely populated area and has 33 member states. It is a relatively large treaty in comparison with the Non-proliferation Treaty, which was open for signature just a year later, and to which the Treaty of Tlatelolco inspired some of its provisions, particularly on Articles 4, Article 5, and 7. It has 32 articles and 2 additional protocols that we will further analyze. With regards to the main provisions and obligations of the treaty, I should briefly mention those articles that are important for the purposes of these presentations, which are basically Article 1 and Article 4. Under Article 1, the states parties of the Treaty of Tlatelolco are committed to use nuclear energy exclusively for peaceful purposes. Moreover, it establishes for the first time in a multilateral treaty the explicit reference of the prohibition on many activities regarding nuclear weapons. It explicitly prohibits activities such as the use, the testing, the manufacture, the production, the possession, and acquisition by any means whatsoever of nuclear weapons. It also covers everything what should have been prohibited so that there are no nuclear weapons in the territory. The other article, which is of key importance, is Article 4, which limits the zone of application within which the obligations of all states parties are enforced. This zone of application, it encompasses a surface about 20 million square kilometers. It is the sum of all the territories of the states parties of the Tlatelolco Treaty, plus some areas in the high seas, as defined in the 1982 Convention on the Law of the Sea. And the zone of application, it just became fully enforced in 2002 with the ratification of the treaty by Cuba. And well, at this point, it is precise to mention that even if the zone of application extends to areas in the high seas, it does not constitute any claim of sovereignty over that area by any of the states parties of the Treaty of Tlatelolco. So that is an important point to remember when we further discuss the problematic on the interpretative declarations made by the nuclear weapon states. Now, I will briefly refer to my favorite part of the presentation, which is indeed the contents of the Protocols 1 and Protocol 2 of the Treaty of Tlatelolco. So here you can see the facsimile of the instruments of ratification of the additional Protocol 1, which are the 4 states possessing territories either de jure or de facto in the zone of application, which are France, UK, the US, and the Netherlands. Protocol 2 refers to those nuclear weapon states recognized by the Non-Proliferation Treaty: China, France, the UK, the US, and the USSR, and now Russia. So they signed and ratified this additional protocol to the Treaty of Tlatelolco, for which they undertake not to use or threaten to use nuclear weapons against any state party of Tlatelolco. So what is the main problematic here? Well, the problematic resides in the fact that 4 of the 5 nuclear weapon states, except for China, issued declarations upon the signing or ratification of these additional protocols, which in fact constitute a reservation in accordance with Article 2 of the Vienna Convention on the Law of the Treaties. And therefore, this reservation diminished the guarantee of non-use of nuclear weapons against the state parties of the Treaty of Tlatelolco, and limits the zone of application by arguing there's a claim of sovereignty by the state parties. So this is a demand that it is not new. It has been recalled in several UN General Assembly resolution. It has been recalled in the NPT review conference's final documents, also in the final declarations of the Conference of the States Parties of states parties to nuclear weapon-free zones and Mongolia. The need of the nuclear weapon-free zones to withdraw or to modify these interpretative declarations. So even if there has been constant demand, there has not been a concrete proposal on how to overcome this problematic. So in recent years, the OPANAL member states have conceived an idea, an initiative to solve this issue, and it is a proposal of adjustment. This proposal of adjustment is basically a document that could have the form of a single individual resolution, an agreement or memorandum of understanding that will be signed by the state parties to the Treaty of Tlatelolco and by the 4 nuclear weapon states that have issued interpretative declarations. So in order to this initiative to crystallize and to go ahead, it is necessary that the nuclear weapon states should demonstrate some willingness to engage in this discussion. So the state parties of Tlatelolco have constantly recalled these 4 states to withdraw, to modify these proposals, and then they have sent these proposals, but well, it has been overlooked any response, any reaction from the nuclear weapon states. So, and the importance of this adjustment is that the interpretative declarations would be now analyzed under the current international law agreements. Since the time of the creation of the additional protocol 1 and the additional protocol 2, many international agreements have evolved, have been created, and international law per se has been codified in a way that these declarations are are not longer valid nor effective. For instance, the 1982 UN Convention of the Law of the Sea, it was just finished in the 80s and entered into force in the 90s. So this contentious aspect on the high seas, it was only issued and taken into account in the existing international law by the time it was created. So to finalize and to provide some arguments in favor of this adjustment is that the main objective of this adjustment is to preserve the integrity of the nuclear weapon-free zone in Latin America by eliminating any controversy, if agreed between the parties. It would not only be beneficial for the 33 Latin American states parties to the treaty, but also to the nuclear weapon states as well. It could demonstrate their willingness to engage in this initiative. Also, in case of this advancement of this proposal, that could be also replicated by other nuclear weapon-free zones that are, in fact, having some problems with their additional protocols. So it could be best practice or a lesson learned on how to engage with nuclear weapon states. And to conclude, I would argue that there's not such a thing of small initiatives, and every single initiative should be considered and analyze its viability. The member states of OPANAL are convinced that this proposal has the potential to finally come into terms with 4 nuclear weapon states that issued interpretive declarations. So in a time when there is a greater need of understanding and to avoid confrontational rhetoric, it is necessary that the states parties and relevant stakeholders assume their own responsibilities in order to agree on common grounds. So this proposal of adjustment has the potential to solve decades-long controversy with nuclear weapon states. Moreover, as I mentioned earlier, this could be also a matter of cooperation and exchange of information with other nuclear weapon-free zones. And absolutely, it could be a positive sign and applause for the nuclear weapon states to the next NPT review conference, so they can demonstrate some willingness to fulfill their obligations under Article 6 of the NPT and Article 7, of course. And with that, I end up my presentation, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Many thanks, Alain, for this very comprehensive overview of the Treaty of Tlatelolco, also on the necessity to find common grounds and the proposal that you have shared with us. Now the floor goes to Phonenipha.
All right. Thank you very much, Federica. And thank you very much for allowing me to speak at this very important session on regional threat on non-proliferation and arms control. I was the participant to this event in 2016, and it's such a great honor to come back again this year to as a speaker. So my topic of discussion today will be about the challenges. Well, let me first share the screen. I don't know if I can do it properly. Do you see my slide?
Yes, we do.
All right. So the topic today will be the challenges in establishing and maintaining a state system of accounting for and control of nuclear material, or SSAC. And I will specifically provide some perspective from my region. I choose this topic because even though it is not regarded as a major threat to the non-proliferation and disarmament in the region, but it is a challenge for states in the region to fulfill its safeguards obligation, and it is also posing a lot of difficulties for the IAEA to do its job on safeguards in this region. So my presentation will be based on my practical experience working in the area. And of course, the concept I present here today will certainly need further study. But the purpose today is to bring your attention to see how can we do further, how to approach these states in order to overcome these difficulties, considering that there are more and more countries in the region that wish to pursue with nuclear technology, for example, nuclear power plant or research reactor. So my presentation will be divided in 4 parts, but I promise I will not go through every slide for the sake of time. First, let me start with a quick background on what is the state system of accounting for and control of nuclear material. So this SSAC is one of the main obligations for states that have comprehensive safeguards agreement, or the CSA, enforced. So what is this CSA? It is the obligation under the NPT for non-nuclear weapon state party to conclude the CSA with the International Atomic Energy Agency. So as you can see, among other things, under the obligation of the CSA, it is required by the state to establish and maintain the SSAC. Do you see my slide? I'm sorry.
We see the first one. We see the introductory one. We don't see slide number 2.
Oh, sorry. Let me fix that.
You may want to try with clicking on slide number 2 on the left. If not, we can ask our technicians perhaps to intervene and show the PowerPoint.
That could be helpful, yes.
Okay, so Sarah, if you could please share the PowerPoint, it would be very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. So, yeah, you can go on to the 3rd slide, maybe.
And Phonenipha, when you want the technicians to change slide, perhaps just say change slide so they know. Okay.
Okay. Change to the 3rd slide. Yes, this is the one. So sorry about that. This is the brief background so that you see why is this, where is this SSAC coming from. It is basically the obligation under the CSA. So we can of course further discuss on this during the Q&A, of course. And next slide, please. So yeah, in brief, what is it exactly, this SSAC? So it is a state system to control, to collect data on nuclear material, and it helps the states to keep track and have a proper information to report to the IAEA under its safeguards obligation. And why is it so important? It is important because It helps the state, again, to have a comprehensive information on nuclear material to report to the IAEA. And also, the IAEA is relying on this SSAC to verify, to do its job in verifying that the nuclear material is not diverted to non-peaceful purposes. So therefore, this SSAC is a critical component for the effective implementation of safeguards. And how do we establish and maintain this SSAC? Well, states normally designate a state authority responsible for safeguards. They call it SRA, which is the authority who's in charge of, among other things, coordinate with the IAEA to facilitate the safeguards implementation while establishing and maintaining the SSAC. It is important to note that there is no fixed structure for this SRA, but it is the most important thing is it is entrusted by the law that to enable the state to fulfill its safeguards obligation, including by establishing and maintaining the SSAC, providing the IAEA with the information, and also facilitate the inspection of the IAEA, etc. Next slide, please. Here you will have, well, there's a lot of information on my slides, but I think I will skip this one and the next one. Please proceed to slide 7, which related to the challenges. Next one, please. Yes, I will jump directly to the challenges that some states are facing to establish and maintain the SSAC in the region. So challenge number 1 is the awareness of safeguards and SSAC. It is a very general assumption of some states that safeguards is only for the states with large quantity of nuclear material and nuclear fuel cycle activities, which is not correct. And because of that assumption, they think that safeguards is not relevant to them. That is why they don't really lead. And this assumption leads to my second point, second challenge, which is the state priority. Since they don't think that is relevant to them, of course, they do not prioritize implementing safeguards and the establishment and maintaining of this SSAC is relevant to them because it's not their priority. Challenge number 3 is the structure of national regulatory authority. This is a challenge. Why? Because since there's no fixed format on how to place the regulatory authority, and because of the limited human resource and budget, many states in ASEAN just add this NRA as the additional task within their existing entity. For example, some country just established this NRA within their Ministry of Education, for example. This type of NRA also, well, it could work, but the coordination between the state itself and the IAEA could be less effective. And this type of NRA also pose difficulty for decision makers to have a clear understanding and good policy on safeguards implementation, because safeguards is not his or her area of experts. So that's the problem. Challenge number 4 is the cost of safeguards implementation. Since many countries in ASEAN are developing countries, they have limited means and institution capacity to implement safeguards, while they also have to delivering other demanding priorities. So it is difficult for developing countries to allocate their limited funding and manpower to establish an independent body specifically to handle safeguards and SSAC. And the final challenge is the related to the assistance which is available upon request. It is the practice of international organizations that they would only provide their assistance upon the request of the state. So here the question is, why would a state request for assistance if they think that it is not relevant to them? So again, it goes back to my first point related to the awareness. And also in some case, the state probably know their obligation under safeguards, but they do not feel comfortable to open up and to show the mess in their backyard. So they simply do not ask for help. Next slide, please. So I will conclude my presentation with some recommendation here. My first recommendation is to have a tailor-made materials or approaches. Since safeguards is very technical, it is a complicated subject to master, and most of publications, recommendations, guidelines, they are all available only in English or some, UN working language. And plus, the term used in the safeguards are not easy to understand. A lot of officers in these states have limitation on mastering this complicated subject in English. And in this context, the trainings that are provided by the IAEA should probably taking into account more the current situation of the country. By saying that, I mean the states that do not have big quantity of nuclear material or activity, they don't have to know how to count the nuclear materials in a nuclear power plant, for example. Just give them what they need to know, very straightforward, and maybe also consider to have a training in their national language. I know there's a lot of initiative by the organization to have train the trainer program, but here I would like to emphasize more to train the local trainer, so that local trainer can do their training in their own country, in their own language whenever they need. This would take more time because of the safeguards itself is complicated to master, but it will take time for a local authority to really master it, so that they can further train their national personnel. With that, before I move on to the second point, I would like to emphasize that some outreach mission of the IAEA needs more follow-up action to maintain the knowledge within the states. For example, the IAEA doesn't need to come to the states every year or every 2 years to organize the outreach event, but they can only come once and then follow up that, as following that event, they can already develop a work plan for the follow-up action, so that in that way the IAEA can get the most out of each mission, and then my second recommendation is to remember that the best practice is not a guidance. There's a lot of encouragement from the IAEA to share the best practice. Here, I would like to emphasize that the best practice is somehow should not be used as a guidance. It doesn't say how to achieve things. It shows this successful story that is already achieved. But it is important, of course, to keep the inspiration and to show that establishing and maintaining the SSAC is achievable. But let's not fall in a trap between between having a best practice and the guideline or guidance. And my third point, third recommendation is inside out and top down. By inside out, I mean the country needs to, in order to make the country open up and accept help, the IAEA can consider a closer interaction with an individual who is working at technical level to know further, to know more about her need, his need or her need, in order to, provide proper support and make his or her task easier. And also top down. By saying top down, I mean in the context of developing countries, IAEA might consider engaging with high-level officers at either national or regional level, because sometimes this is just a question of awareness of awareness at the high level. And recommend number 4 is the difference between partner country and tutor country. Some country open up only with other country that they feel comfortable with, and the IAEA already had a lot of projects at the regional level, and they recently signed the practical arrangement with ASEAN. And in order to contribute to this synergy, I think regional approach is good, but IAEA could also consider engaging with several individual states that the SSAC needs to be improved. For example, by putting 2 countries with commonalities together, let them work together, let them identify their own best approach, because they know best what works for them. And of course, during this process, the IAEA and other member states can facilitate and support. My final recommendation is related to the reinforcement of assistance from the IAEA. Currently, IAEA is starting a new initiative. It's called Compass, which is a mission that is aiming to provide assistance and services tailored to the state's need. In order to have this, to contribute to this initiative, I think IAEA should plan better their assistance project. The assistance project should be planned according to the needs of the country, based on this assessment, of course, throughout the missions and also through the discussion with the states. After such assessment, a clear and precise work plan should be developed, and this plan should lay out the sequence of activities phase by phase. Don't tell the state, they don't have to tell the state to run from point A to point Z, but tell them to walk from point A to point B, and then point B to point C. So, but of course, this could take a longer time, but I believe this approach is more sustainable for the state. And finally, before I end, in order to reinforce this assistance, the assistance from the IAEA, I think the IAEA can promote more the assistance that is available at the agency by engaging with technical level, national level, and also regional level, and make sure that countries understand what they need and how can they benefit from those assistance. So that would end my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention, and I will be happy to engage in the Q&A session.
Thank you very much, Phonenipha. Having done some work on this myself in my previous position, I found your presentation very terrific and very explanatory on why some countries lag behind in implementation of regulations. So thank you very much again. And now the floor goes to Nour.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, a little bit distant.
Oh, now is it better?
Better, better, thank you. But we cannot see you.
Oof, 1 second. Now?
Perfect.
Okay, I'm just gonna try to share my screen. Could the IT share it? Because I've never used Zoom before, and I can't find my PowerPoint on the application window.
Sarah, could you please share Nour's presentation? Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. So today I'll be talking about the prospects of a bilateral agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran, which aims to denuclearize both states and which could be used as a pathway to improve denuclearization in the Middle East, as it was the case for Brazil and Argentina, with the Brazilian-Argentine Agency for Accounting and Control of Nuclear Materials, known as the ABAC, in 1990. So the question, the host asked you to start your video. You can't see me? Can you see me?
Yes, we can see you and we can also see the presentation.
Okay, perfect. Sorry. So the question around which this presentation revolves is the following. To what extent could one benefit from the ABAC and apply it to the Iran-Saudi case? And what format would that bilateral agreement take if it were ever to be implemented? So before starting, I would just want to clarify that what I'm about to say only involves me. It does not reflect the IAEA's position and point of view on the matter. So I'll start off. Could you go please to the next slide? The one after, the background. Thank you. So I'll just start off with some background information. As you all probably know, President Trump's withdrawal from the JCPOA led to escalation of tension in the Gulf. Ironically, given Trump's argument that the deal was too weak to prevent Iran from developing nuclear weapons, the increased hostility and reestablishment of sanctions against Iran may have redirected its leaders towards thinking about the value of having nuclear weapons. So that's a dangerous path that could trigger a nuclear race between Iran and its neighbors, especially Saudi Arabia. Now, despite the grim geopolitical context, neither Iran nor Saudi Arabia can afford further escalation that would send a shockwave through the global system. I mean, Iran's economy has been under considerable strain for quite some time, and Saudi Arabia remains highly reliant on oil revenues. So any military escalation is likely to threaten its vulnerable oil export infrastructure and limit the freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz, through which, by the way, 20% of the global oil supply passes every day. Now, can you go to the next slide, please? Talks of a safeguard agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran may seem outlandish given the depth of the hostility between the two states, but such an agreement can be a helpful tool because it identifies issues of mutual concern and it contributes to their resolution through diplomatic channels whenever a window of opportunity opens, of course. Now, in the past, many scholars have thought about the possibility of a multilateral agreement. I think that it would be more efficient and easier to start off on a bilateral level, as most challenges the Middle East faces nowadays are mainly proxies of the Iran-Saudi rivalry. So the multilateral agreement could potentially be envisioned once the bilateral one has been cemented. Now, to envision what an Iran-Saudi deal might look like, I thought it would be helpful to look at an example of bilateralism that works between countries that had and continue to have conflicting political and economic interests. The ABAC between Argentina and Brazil led in 1990 to a bilateral denuclearization and later on to a nuclear weapon-free zone in Latin and South America with the Tlatelolco Treaty. Now, regardless of the abysmal differences between these two regions, studying such a success story can provide the Iranian and Saudi diplomats with a framework and a tool to understand the technical issues to be addressed to guarantee an efficient safeguard system. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk a bit about the Argentine-Brazil relation. They haven't confronted one another militarily since the 1820s, but they were known to be militarily economic and political regional rivals, and this rivalry was reflected through their political nuclear programs. Concerning Brazil, it received in the 1950s a research reactor fueled by 90% enriched uranium from the United States under the Atoms for Peace program. Obviously, since then, it has been returned to the US, but back then it highly contributed to the development of its nuclear program. As for Argentina, according to the Brazil's National Information Service, it was considered as the absolute leader in the nuclear field in South America in the early 80s, while Brazil's nuclear program lacked in focus. But after Brazil's 1982 economic crisis and Argentina's involvement in the Falkland War, a rapprochement between the two countries took place, and it was exacerbated with their need to overthrow the military, which had monopoly on both governments, and with the establishment of the Mercosur trade agreement. So this sum of factors prompted the creation of the ABAC agreement in 1991. Now, the agreement is a bilateral inspection system which has for objective to apply the state system of accounting for and control of nuclear material, known as SSACs in the IAEA language, but the ABAC refers to it as SCCC, so that's the term I will be using. So in other words, the SCCC ensures that no material used in their various nuclear activities is employed for nuclear weapons. So the agreement not only creates barriers to proliferation, but it also reduces the country's motivation for having nuclear weapons by building trust and mutual dependency through economic ties. Nowadays, the ABAC is made up of the Commission, which is the governing body, and the Secretariat, which is the executive body. And there are 4 technical sectors within the Secretariat, each of which is led simultaneously by an Argentine and a Brazilian officer. And their functions are basically to carry out the activities necessary for the application of the SCCC and to represent the ABAC before the national authorities and third parties. Now, the verification system also includes a cross-inspection regime where Brazilian inspectors inspect Argentine facilities and vice versa, and it comprises of more or less 50 inspectors from each country. Now, to maintain international recognition, the parties to the agreement also coordinate the verification process with the IAEA, which makes sure that the SCCC is effectively used. This coordination guarantees a more complete safeguard system. Can you go to the next slide, please? Now, while the ABAC could serve as a guideline for a potential nuclear safeguard agreement between Iran and Saudi Arabia, the situations are not entirely similar. Argentina and Brazil both share common religion, common colonialist past, and less diversified and intense external influences, especially since the end of the Cold War. Whereas the Middle Eastern geopolitical dynamics are much more complex and deeply rooted for various reasons, including the Sunni Shia schism that goes back to the 7th century and is still playing out between Saudi Arabia and Iran. In fact, religion in the Middle East is often perceived as a full-fledged identity, which is why the main conflicts are proxies of the Iran-Saudi rivalry, as they oppose Sunni to Shia communities. And since the 1980s, both countries have manifested hegemonic ambitions in the region. So far, Iran has been more successful at it because it was able to form long-term allies, such as Hezbollah in Lebanon. So can you go to the next slide, please? I'm going to delve now into the details and the format of the agreement. First of all, given the extremely low chances of establishing such an agreement between Iran and Saudi Arabia, the ideal format would be a 3-phase one for trust to incrementally build in. The first stage would deal with immediate issues, those that have high conditions of success and which could be solved within a relatively short period of time. Accordingly, the resolution of those issues would ultimately contribute to increased trust between the two countries. The most fundamental requirements would be first, Iran's return to the JCPOA, which it started breaching in June 2019 as a reaction to Trump's withdrawal. Second, Saudi Arabia's approval of the IAEA Additional Protocol to guarantee that its program has no military end. Third, of course, winning down the costly war in Yemen. And lastly, normalizing the diplomatic relations between the two states, which were broken in 2016. Now, in the meantime, an increase in economic trade could also be helpful, since history has shown us that peace relies upon economic interdependency. And unfortunately, only 6% of the trade is conducted within the MENA region. Now, having re-established diplomatic relations, a more open and direct dialogue will take place, entering the intermediate phase, which will deal with establishing a security framework that has the blessing of world powers, of course. Now, such a framework could include the depoliticization of oil, putting limitations on military capabilities, and creating a navigation agency which supervises the entry and exit of ships, whether it be in Iranian or Saudi maritime territory, and that facilitates exports, renders the risk of smuggling, and appeases the tensions. So this phase will allow those concerned to test the waters by assessing their cooperative skills, the level of trust, etc. Now, only once sufficient trust has been established will the advanced phase be launched, as it will address nuclear issues, mainly by banning high-enriched uranium, nuclear spent fuel reprocessing, and stockpile material. It will also limit enrichment to less than 5% to guarantee that no nuclear bomb is in the making, while making sure that the nuclear material acquired is used only for civilian use. Can you go on to the next slide, please? So the agreement might take the form of a generalized JCPOA, but with the issue of the missile program tackled as well. In fact, only short-range missiles will be allowed in exchange of adhering to the missile technology control regime. Now, I wrap up with an interesting idea to further explore, which is a shared high-power research reactor fueled by low-enriched uranium that not only would help the Middle Eastern scientific community in their research, but also contribute to the improvement of the transparency by clarifying each party's knowledge and understanding on the issue. Ideally, the reactor would be located in a country such as Bahrain, and with Iran's extensive knowledge and Saudi Arabia's financial resources, this project will be cost beneficial. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nour, first of all, for this very interesting presentation and for the innovative thinking, but also for respecting the timeline and keeping in the 10 minutes time frame. So with that, I'm happy to open the floor for questions. I don't see any raised hand, which is a little bit sad because we really wanted you to appear in video as well, but I see 3 questions, actually 2 questions from the VCDMP, and 1 comment from Sonia Nax, who says that the presentation on treaty was really impressive. I would say that all presentations were really impressive today. So the first question goes to Dr. Notte. Based on one post to me earlier today, okay, how might we go about recovering trust between the US and Iran and others vis-a-vis the JCPOA, bearing in mind Iranian nervousness about US policy changing with each administration? What advice would you give to the Americans, Iranians, and others on the topic?
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's a difficult question, and I think it is certainly a tall order to restore trust between the Iranians and the Americans, given what has happened over the last 2 years since Trump took the Americans out of the JCPOA. The maximum pressure campaign has had an intense impact on the Iranian economy. I understand that those in Iran, the non-moderates, the IRGC, who opposed the nuclear agreement to start with, feel vindicated by what happened over the last 2 years, i.e. the United States is not to be trusted. I don't think they will want a return to any agreement. Let's not forget that Iran has elections coming up next June. So there's a very short window between Biden's inauguration and the Iranian elections in June, in which the moderates, Rouhani, still being in power, can accomplish something with the Americans. So what should the US do? I think what's required is a strong signal early on by the Biden administration, a clean return to the JCPOA through executive orders. That's something that Biden can do, which would entail a lifting of sanctions. I mean, Zarif has said himself a few days ago, and there's a lot of rhetoric coming out of Iran these days. Zarif has said that 3 executive orders by the Biden administration would suffice to bring the US back into the JCPOA. I think what that would also require is a certain degree of patience on the part of the United States for Iran to come back into compliance with the JCPOA. From what I understand, for Iran to roll back some of the steps that it has taken in contravention to the JCPOA, a few weeks will be required, for instance, to ship excess uranium abroad and similar steps. So there the Americans will have to be lenient. I think it would also help if the US coupled this with some other confidence building measures on detainees or other issues. And of course, it would really help at a point like this if Iran's partners in the Security Council, like Russia, like China, could also play a positive role here in encouraging Iran to resume dialogue with the United States. That is a role that Russia has played in the past. Now, unfortunately, given where we are in American-Chinese and American-Russian relations, I believe it's quite unlikely that those two powers will come to the help of the US. So I think strong steps from the US at the beginning would help. And then, quite frankly, also, if you want to get the Iranians to trust you more again, it'll be important how broad a US policy towards the region will shake out. There's, of course, an Iranian perception today that under the Trump administration, US policy has been incredibly pro-Israel and pro-Saudi and has singled out Iran as the one culprit in the region. And there would have to be a perception that that also changes more broadly.
Thank you very much, Anna. We have another question for Mr. Blancas. From the VCDMP again. In your view, is it one state more than another between France, Russia, and the US and the UK that is resistant to adjusting their withdrawal caveat under Tlatelolco's protocol? What is your perception of the reasons that such an adjustment has not happened?
Thank you, Federica, and thank you, Noah, for the very interesting and difficult question. So regarding which country is more reluctant to agree on this adjustment, I would probably say that they are like equally reluctant. There is like this misperception that state parties to the Treaty of Tlatelolco, they are proposing or they have the intention to ask for additional obligations or commitments to the 4 nuclear weapon states. However, I think the 2 of them, which are France and Russia, have been more approachable, and they have started and they have been engaged in exchange of correspondence with the member states of OPANAL and the agency itself in ways we can collaborate and solve this issue. However, I think one of the main difficulties in finding a definite and long-term solution is, besides of this misperception, is that the proposal has not yet reached the higher levels of decision making. And I'm speaking in terms of the ministers of foreign affairs. I think at some point these proposals have stuck like in the bureaucratic chain inside the ministries, and there's a lack of following up on how we can and how the member states of OPANAL and how the 4 nuclear weapon states could agree on this adjustment. And so, yeah, that probably would be my answer. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Alain, we have another question for Hanna. Do you think China's increasing presence and evolving role in the Middle East pose a threat or help Middle East nuclear stability?
Sure. Thank you, Virginia, for the question. I mean, I'll start maybe by saying that it's certainly true that the factor of China's presence in the Middle East has become increasingly a factor to reckon with when we talk about regional security more broadly in the Middle East. I worked for a Track 2 organization before my current role with CNS, and we actually had a Track 2 process on Middle East security, including Iran and the nuclear issue, quite a comprehensive approach that included the global powers, including the Chinese, because especially from the US point of view, there's a perception that China is slowly encroaching on the region. It's forming strategic and defense partnerships with various regional countries, of course, especially with Iran more recently. And there's a lot of suspicion as to what the Chinese are trying to achieve in the region. So the Middle East is, of course, looked at through the prism of great power competition very much these days. And that pertains to Russia, but it increasingly pertains to China as well. Now, if we come to the nuclear question specifically, I guess China hasn't been the main player here when it comes to the Iranians, for instance. There, I think on the Security Council, it's been Russia that was the main Iranian ally that needed to be brought along in past years on relevant agreements. And there was, I think, a perception that China would align with Russia's position when it comes to Iran in the Security Council, and Russia would do the same vis-a-vis China on North Korea. But more recently, of course, there have been allegations, for instance, that the Chinese are getting more invested in the Saudi nuclear program. Actually, colleagues of mine at CNS have published an interesting studies only a few weeks ago that looked at those allegations of Saudi uranium mining and milling and the extent of Chinese involvement in that, and found that so far nothing suggests that Saudi Arabia is in violation of its safeguards agreements, but it is something that people are increasingly watching. So I think this goes to say that China is increasingly becoming a player that needs to be reckoned with when we look at these issues.
Thank you, Anna. We have a comment, I would say, and a technical question for Nour. Do you think, Nour, that the Trump administration withdrawal from the JCPOA forced Iran to think again about their nuclear weapons and perhaps rebuilding their nuclear weapons program because it has affected Iran's economy? Sonia says, the US and Russia should also stop proxy wars in the Middle East because it is necessary for peace in the Middle East. So Nour, sorry, the floor is yours.
Yeah, Sonia, I completely agree with your comment regarding proxy wars. Now, it's a very good question. I would say, assuming Iran from the start wanted to build a nuclear weapon, because so far we don't really have a proof. The Trump administration, I mean, it has isolated Iran very much in the international sphere. Now, again, I don't think. I mean, I know I said in the presentation that it would have reassessed the value of nuclear weapons, but it was more to put a bit in the context of what I was trying to convey. But I do think that now, like Hanna already said it, in June 2021, there are going to be elections in Iran, and most probably the hardliners are gonna win because of the humiliation Trump has given them. So if the moderates weren't trying to think of towards nuclear weapons, the hardliners most probably would want to, especially that nuclear weapons in countries such as Iran are seen as a how to say it, it raises the national sentiment. It's like a national pride. On the Iranian dollar, I don't know what's it called, the rial, there is like a symbol of the atom. So it's a lot for them. So that's my question. Thank you. My answer.
Thank you very much, Nour. I also see we have our first attendee who would like to ask question, Sylvain Faniel.
Yes, as we are encouraged by the organizers to raise our hand, I think I'm maybe the first one during the day, so I'm happy to do so at the end of the event. Thanks very much for the organizers for the day first, but also for those presentations in this panel, which referred a lot to the agency, and I do have a very straightforward question to Nour, which proposed, in my view, a very innovative approach that I've never heard before. And my question are as follows. So two very short questions. So what would be the role of the agency in the context of such an agreement? Do you see any similarities, differences with the role the agency is playing in the context of ABAC? And the second question is, ABAC has an organization. Do you foresee the same for here in your scenario? And what would be also differences and similarities in comparison to what we have with ABAC? Thank you.
Hi, Sylvain.
Hello.
Thank you for your questions. So, first of all, regarding the IAEA's role, it should, so far it has done a very good job at monitoring Iran's program, with the JCPOA, and the Iranians were very complacent and they opened recently access to IAEA inspectors for 2 facilities. So I think the IAEA should continue on that role, try to maybe more focus on Saudi Arabia because its nuclear program is growing fast and it's still on the SQP, which is not enough for such a developed program. So the IAEA, or maybe more the partners, those involved in the JCPOA, should push more the E3, B5+1, etc., should push more towards encouraging Saudi Arabia to implement the additional protocols, to increase, to encourage, so that Iran could see that Saudi Arabia on the other hand is doing also something, and it's not only Iran who's being under constant supervision. To be fair, Iran has the strictest inspection system that any country has ever had. So there should be some balance. Now, regarding the second question, which was the similarities between ABAC and what I suggest for Iran, Saudi Arabia. So they do have an organization. Ideally, although like I said it in the presentation, it's very unlikely that such an agreement would take place between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Ideally, they should have such an organization to facilitate the exchange of inspectors and just to have organization and administration purpose. I think there was another question, like another subset in your question regarding ABAC that I didn't take into account. I think it's the similarities and differences. Is that it?
No, I think you answered the question.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, thank you.
And if you want to talk further, I know where you work.
We will.
Well, thank you very much. We are unfortunately running terribly out of time, very behind schedule, but I thought the conversation was so interesting that we really couldn't just stop it on time. So please, let's give a round of applause to all the speakers for their incredible job.